Thank you everyone for joining us again today for Cure's Rural Women Leading series. Today's topic for us is democracy, not theocracy, and we have some wonderful panelists joining us. Let's go ahead and Kathy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Kathy Hartley. I'm a mainly retired ELCA Lutheran pastor that lives in the Spicer area. Well, right now I'm not in Spicer. I'm in Hawaii, but I wanted to do this because this is really important to me. And I'll be talking more about that, of course, when we address some of the questions. But hello to everybody.
Hello.
And Kay and Annette, would you like to go ahead?
Yes. And I'm Kay Fernholz. I'm a school sister of Notre Dame, a sister, a nun, whatever is what you'd like to call me. And I entered the community in 1956. My sister and I live on a little farm near Madison, Minnesota, and it's the farm that we grew up on. And we've been here for 30 years, and we call it Earthrise Farm. So it's really good to be here tonight.
I'm Annette, and I consider myself a rural woman. And I think it's because you've gotten something going here with a marvelous understanding of how women in the rural areas really have a muscle they might use someday in this crisis we're in. And we've been here 30 years on the farm. And so I consider myself truly a rural woman, and I'm glad to be part of this.
Thank you all so much. And I'm so excited to have all of you here to take part in this discussion. My name, if I didn't say it before, is Misty Butler, and I am the digital media director here at Cure. And it's just an honor to have you here today. So I think, why don't we just dive right in with some questions? And the first question I have down is for Annette. And just as kind of a base setting for us here, what is Christian nationalism and what is it not?
Well, that's a heavy, heavy question. And Kay and I have been sitting together up here in this sunroom since we got asked and privileged and invited to come to this. So I think between the question that you just asked and what I have to say and what Kay has to say might bleed into each other's answer to the question, if that's okay with you. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I was going to kind of set a little stage for myself in light of where we are and who we are. And I was going to I brought a corn husk to our little webinar tonight because the yard is just full of them. The winds have been so gusty, and our yards have just caught all of them coming off the fields. And so it just triggered something in me that would probably speak of the rural environs that we might all be relating to because we have come together under that title. And I have written poetry before, so maybe somewhere during the rest of the webinar, I'll share it with you, but because it's about a corn husk. And then I just wanted to read something from scripture too that might just have a little connection in your minds about why I brought the corn husk. May I read it?
Yes, please.
Once on a Sabbath, Jesus was walking through the standing grain. His disciples were pulling off grain heads, shelling them with their hands and eating them. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is prohibited on the Sabbath?" Jesus said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and his men were hungry? How he entered God's house and took and ate the holy bread and gave it to his men, even though only the priests were allowed to eat it." Now, I thought there was a little hint of Christian nationalism in that reading. So perhaps it'll come back again in our discussion. And it just touched me because it's a very fine line. We really, that was a heavy question, Christian nationalism. I think that it's a challenge to dig into it and to come out still being nice, still being kind, still being kind of generous, because I think there are places in the world where rules and policies and doctrines are less important than kindness. And so if I could put a little synoptic twitch to that response to that question, it would simply be in that line. There are places in the world where rules and policies and doctrines are less important than kindness. I'm going to add some more later. Okay, do you want to answer that, Kate?
Whenever your questions come up, yes.
Did you want to also talk about what Christian nationalism is? Okay.
I have some thoughts here. Yes. It's really important to remember that Christian nationalism is not Christian religion. And I think it's very important to make that distinction. There are many definitions for Christian nationalism, and one that I kind of take to is Christian nationalism can have, well, it's but one way of looking, and it is seeing it as a political ideology. And it's an ideology that wants to merge Christian beliefs and symbols and make them be something for public policy and for the national identity. And so they pick one sort of religion, and then everybody, and even the government, deals with that. They mix them up. That would be one thing that I would want to say about that. And I would have more to say later.
Okay, thank you. Kathy, do you have any thoughts on that? Just generally what Christian nationalism is that you'd like to add, or?
Well, yes, and this will come up later too, but there was a statement back in 2019, actually, that was signed by many denominations against Christian nationalism, August of 2019, and basically stated that worship at a church, mosque, synagogue, or temple in America should have there should be no second-class faith or people of no faith. All are equal under the Constitution. And the idea is that there shouldn't be one privileged religion in the United States. And it seeks to merge, I think we heard this too, about Christian and American identities. So it distorts the Christian faith and the constitutional democracy. It demands that Christianity be privileged by the state. In order to be a good American, one must be a Christian. And so that is what we are fighting against as progressive people of faith.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
And I think too, to add to this question, because I think it takes us all across the spectrum, I would add that not that we don't have to have a national identity. I think we do. I think all nations have that. We do not have them, but each of us is a crossroads of a multi-layered identity. And so that one identity can possibly contain the identities of each of us in one nation. And it seems to me that this is how we are, basically not because we are all equal in the world, but because we are all different. It's that DEI within the human race that has to stay alive in order to have a healthy nation that isn't just nationally known to be Christian.
Thank you. Well, I've got another question here, unless anybody has, I know that was a big one for our first question. So the next question I have is for you, Kay. When does Christianity cross the line into Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I like that question. And it really led me along lots of things. And what I gleaned from that is I think it's important to remember that we're not the first people that lived on this land. That so often is forgotten because our indigenous brothers and sisters were here long before us, before the white European colonizers came over. And the spirituality of our indigenous brothers and sisters was not known as Christian, although I believe that it had much to do about what is true of Christianity and what we sometimes wish we were more like, because people were so inclusive of all created beings. Now, the United States was founded as a Christian nation. So we believe that everything about Christianity, that's what we thought then, everything about Christianity had to be infused in all aspects of the American society. And if you think that way, well, then you're going to believe that the Christian God and that Christian religion that you are saying is the only one, then it has to take over the laws, what kind of TV shows, what music, what family structures. But thanks be to God for the Constitution, because that makes a clear demarcation, and it makes it between the church and the state. And it says that no one religion can dictate or endorse itself as the only way. And the First Amendment is about freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. So people are actually free from government interfering. Now, just as an example of some of that, some churches believe, or some religions believe that at the time of conception, that little embryo is already a human being, whereas others do not. Annette and I in our Catholic Church, that's what we're taught, that life begins at conception, but that's not everybody's belief. So that's why freedom of conscience would then say that we cannot impose that belief on everybody else. And we can't also infiltrate our classrooms and teach just that. And sometimes that has happened, and there's been penalties connected with it. So I think it would be wrong if we would be crossing the line. For example, like in West Virginia, all classrooms by law were demanded to display plaques that read, "In God We Trust." And that's, I think, true also with regard to the books that are being taken off the shelves. That is definitely interfering with the beliefs of people and some of their own spiritual beliefs. And then, of course, we know that, or at least I found out that it's interesting that 3 out of 10 in Americans believe, just 3, that America is a Christian nation. 3 out of 10. And most Christian nationalists are being put into powerful leadership positions these days. And I don't think we will deny that. Every day we hear it. And that's becoming very scary. It's certainly not democracy. We look at our Supreme Court, and we have judges there like Amy Coney Barrett. And she believes that the decisions that she makes in court have to be the kind that her religion tells her she needs to do. And there again, we need the separation. So those are some thoughts that I have right now, and others may come up.
Thank you, Kay. Does anybody else have anything to add on that question? Just from the panel, or?
Just a couple of things about specifically what we would stand against in Christian nationalism. We would not believe the U.S. Constitution was divinely inspired, would not
Yeah.
believe that Christianity should be the privileged religion, or that the United States has a special status in God's eyes,
Yes.
or that good Americans must hold Christian beliefs. And we're hearing so much of this now from the right-wing part of the Republican Party, mostly. But there are others too across the board that believe that the U.S. is privileged in God's eyes more than other nations. And so that's the kind of thing we are standing against.
Thank you.
And I think it's good to admit to ourselves sometimes that we've been under the influence of national Christianity in a lot of ways since our childhood. And it seems to me that the pathways in our brains have to really be examined when we give our first impression of what we're hearing now in the whole understanding of what America stands for. There's really some restoration that has to take place in we who are part of the white privileged people. And I often say, how deep are those ruts, that were continuously drilled into us as we were growing up? And I have to say that I feel kind of out of place many times because I'm fighting those old paths so long and so hard. And so I just wondered how it affects us personally when we hear about Christian nationalism. Is it really part of us? Is it really part of me? And what do I have to do to erase those thinkings or those thoughts about being privileged? I think that's something I'd like to hear sometime in the discussion of people who really have gotten themselves together in a remnant like we have, like the rural women have. We're a remnant, actually, that wants to know more about our own influences and how we work at those. So it comes close to home. It's Christian nationalism is something out there. It's really, we snagged some of it in our own lifestyles, I think.
Thank you. Pastor Ann has joined us now.
I have, but I can't get my video to work.
Well,
and I made myself all pretty.
Oh.
No, I didn't do that. They'll just have to listen, I guess.
well, let's have you be a part of the conversation if you don't mind. Why don't we go ahead and have you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my name is Anne Veldhuisen, and I am a Presbyterian minister. I currently serve two congregations, the Presbyterian Church in Marshall, and then the Federated Presbyterian and Lutheran Church in Russell. And they're both very different churches, both politically and generationally, but they also try to do their best to be loving representatives of the church. So it's been an interesting couple of years since I took on that second one. But I've been in ministry now for, 15 years coming up here. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. Well, since we've got you talking, maybe we'll go ahead and ask you a question.
Yeah.
So how does Christian nationalism distort religious faith for political gain?
Perhaps an easier way to answer that would be how doesn't it? So I'm in the middle of a book right now that I would highly recommend to people. It's called Jesus and John Wayne.
Mm-hmm.
And it's written by Kristen Kolbis-Dumez. And she kind of talks about, she starts by framing it in the era of Trump, but is very specific in saying that this mentality existed long before after him. And then she goes into its roots starting at the beginning of the 20th century. I think for political gain, starting in the era of maybe like Billy Graham, where in order to strengthen the reach of his prototype of Christianity, he tried to set his influence in the White House. The White House wasn't having it, so then he decided, well, I'll just start cherry picking candidates, and I'm popular enough that if I endorse somebody, they'll get elected, and that's exactly what happened. So it instead of taking Christianity for my theological understanding is love, justice, peace. They instead have adopted sort of a sword-wielding Jesus, a warrior Christ, to support their ideals, and to confront their own fears about power and influence and all of that stuff. And, just like any Christian, they use scripture to justify their decisions, but I feel like they distort the overall message of Christianity to gain what most white evangelical men want, and that is power, that is a voice, that is prominence, to be seen as tough and strong themselves.
It must be very interesting to be in front of a parish or a congregation these days with so many alternative facts, and I just admire the courage that you have to face people. My sister Kay, she goes oftentimes to do pulpit supply in some of the neighboring churches here in Madison, Minnesota. And she's only had one walkout, which I think says quite a bit about her ability to integrate all of the thinking that's out there right now.
Yeah.
And it's just stunning to me how gently you have to go at this.
You do.
Oh, you do. It must be a scary, scary thing. I used to be kind of in that area of doing a lot of, talking about some of the issues, and I probably am a little bit too bold. I'm not sure, but I don't dare put myself out front because I've been so incorporated with not theocracy, but a lot of theology, spirituality. It just comes, I'm so craving of it because there's so much out there. And so once you reach those little moments in your life where you feel stretched, it takes a lot of courage and a lot of imagination to know how to put that in a happy form for all.
I know.
Yeah, and in kind of piggybacking on what Annette just said, yes, that's where I feel something so great has happened out here, that the ELCA church in my situation here has invited me to do many, many, many pulpit supplies, and they've had times when they didn't have a pastor for months.
Oh, yeah.
The openness, because when I was growing up, oh my gosh, you couldn't even date a Lutheran or somebody who is not Catholic. And if you got a little bit too chummy, they said, you better watch it. And that, I just keep telling those people how wonderful. And that is so against Christian nationalism, because Christian nationalism is divisive. And these people are doing just the opposite, inviting a Catholic sister to lead their services.
Yeah. It is really difficult now for pastors because there's other challenges with membership, with churches shrinking. And also, if you alienate a segment of your congregation, then they're not going to be there to hear the message. I don't feel that so much because I only preach probably once every 6 weeks, very minimally part-time at Bethel Lutheran in Wilmer. But it puts a lot of pressure on the solo pastors or the senior pastors to walk that line. And yet, preparing for this, I was reading about how in Germany in the 1930s, 1/3 of the Lutheran clergy of the German evangelical church joined the the German Christian church, the Hitler church, and Hitler's administration. They were writing the sermons and giving them to them to preach. And then a third of them formed the confessing church. That's Dietrich Bonhoeffer and those that resisted. And a third just tried to say, well, we're not gonna, we're gonna separate those two. The old being silent, which is actually being silent, you are helping the oppressor. And so now we don't want, and I know that's extreme, but now we don't want a repeat of that. The ELCA would like to have, all the clergy in tune with this, rejecting the Christian nationalism, because that's all a part of moving toward a oligarchy. That's part of it. Controlling the religion is part of it. So it's also, I'm not saying crisis, but it's also extremely important for what's going to happen in our country in the future.
Yes.
And our leaders, our Christian leaders, this is falling on them. A lot of it.
Yeah.
Were you going to say something more about that? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut anybody out. Kathy, what do you think the implications of using Christian nationalism to manipulate people are?
What has been frustrating for me is having friends that think this is a good thing, that think it's a good thing to have the 10 Commandments posted in the classrooms and have teachers required to teach on it twice a year like they do in Oklahoma now, and other things that have happened in Florida and Texas, and they think that's all good. And they don't understand the fact that if one religion is held up as a national religion, it could be another one, in 4-8 years down the road. And they don't understand that. And I know I had seen some things out there where they said, well, would you want, a Muslim president to put, Islam as the national religion? And then other pastors said, now don't pick on, don't pick on any religion and say, well, we don't want that one. The point of it is that the separation of church and state protects all of us, and they don't get that. And it's so frustrating sometimes. And these aren't friends in my immediate circle because they all get that. But, other people that I've known or grown up with, and they just think, oh, this is great. This is great to post that stuff. It's great to say that Christianity should, now they've got this department or whatever about in the government looking at how Christianity has been discriminated against. They think all of that is good. And so it's frustrating to have them not see that it's manipulation, because then it puts that, just that religion in control, and that they need to advocate for separation of church and state for their own self. And also, if they see that it's manipulation, some people would wake up, and then they're going to not look upon all religion with favor. And I've seen a lot of this too with the emerging of the, and I don't want to lump everyone together, and I don't want to stereotype. So I'm not saying all the evangelicals. I'm saying like really right-wing evangelicals and their involvement in politics. And since the Tea Party, especially, the last, working to get Trump elected, that colors all the church. Because I have friends that are non-church goers, and they're suspicious of church because of what they've seen on the news. They think we're all like that. And to get it out like, Bishop did at the prayer breakfast in DC, and to say, the mainline denominations, they have an alternative. They have an alternative to Christian nationalism and to this idea that this one religion should be prominent. So that's how I see the manipulation of individuals happening.
Kay, what historical examples show the dangers of merging religion and government?
Okay. Yes. As I start telling about this question, what came to mind was what Annette and I are involved in right now. our community, the School Sisters of Notre Dame, we are in the process of selling our property because we aren't getting new membership. Annette and I are kind of some of the youngest ones.
We'll never tell.
No. and a lot of them at our age, the octogenarian age, which we'll admit that, they're already in nursing homes, etc. Now, as we have made decisions about our property, we've been asked to look at what land, the land that we built all those buildings on and so forth, who owned that land first. And of course, in our case, in Mankato, Minnesota, it was the indigenous Dakota Sioux. So we're studying that whole thing. And when we make our decisions, how do we make it around the fact that there's such a thing as land back and more relationships with our indigenous people? Those are some really deep things that we're dealing with. And 5 of us have been asked to become part of the Land Justice Futures group, which is a group that has sisters from all over the country, communities. They all pick out 5 that come together, and we're part of that. And the reason I bring that up is the heart of that whole thing so far, in many ways, has been the doctrine of discovery. And I wasn't that aware of it until I became part of this. And the doctrine of discovery, it actually refers to a 15th century declaration that came, believe it or not, from Rome, from our Pope. And it served as a legal and a moral and a spiritual and a political justification for the seizure of lands that is inhabited by those that are not Christian. And it became the foundation for European control through the colonies. Now there can't you see the clash between church and state? In fact, it gave explicit permission to invade, to search out and to capture and to vanquish and subdue non-Christians. And we know in the case of our Black brothers and sisters, they were reduced to slavery, brought over. They were property. And because the white colonizers were the important ones, that they could do it. And this doctrine of discovery gave them full reign to do it. And then some other things that have happened in history regarding this. We look at our boarding schools, the Indian boarding schools, which has been in the news a lot these last couple of years. And there again, the government hired sometimes Catholic churches, other religious churches, parishes. They had schools and they brought them to these schools, and they'd grab them out of their homes. I just can't imagine what that was like, because Annette and I both went to boarding school not Indian boarding school, but we went to our mother house boarding school in high school. And it just about broke my heart to leave home when you're only that old. So I think of those little kids torn away from their families. And then it got worse, which we didn't experience. They would force out, I might say, cleanse them of their traditions, their language, their religion. And they'd force them to become Christian and to live like the white people. And that all stems from that doctrine of discovery. And then we look at Jesus himself, his leadership. And what did he say one day? He said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. I think that says it so clearly, and how smart Jesus was. He didn't get trapped There wasn't anything that could respond to that. It was so clear. So he was separating. And then we look in the 1500s, and there we have Queen Elizabeth. And she rules England. And England was a Protestant nation. And she did not acknowledge authority to the Pope in Rome, because of course Henry VIII had gotten on the outs, and he no longer would belong to the Catholic Church, and he started his own. So there we had conflict again. And Elizabeth was the English monarch, and she knew there was really some fighting going on, that she shouldn't be able to take over the religion as well. So she changed the title. She became the supreme governor of the church instead of the head of the church, because they said, well, only Jesus could be the head of the church. And if anybody would deny her that privilege or that honor, they would be accused of treason. And you know what treason, where that led them. We know a lot of saints, people who died under that whole thing. So Protestantism was England's official faith. And it became so much their official faith that the government could decide how they would practice it. They even had a prayer book put together. So you can see how dangerous this was. And the doctrine of discovery, I'm sad to say, Pope Francis has done a lot. He has repudiated it, but it has not been taken out. And we look at how countries just come in, like Ukraine, they're just bombarded by Russia. They can take over. They said, it's ours, we can take it. So that doctrine is still going on. And until we get rid of it, but I think we're stepping more in that direction, keeping the state and the church separate.
Even in more contemporary ideas, when the United States was engaged in Korea and in Vietnam, in order to justify the violence that was taking place at the hands of a Christian nation, they said, well, it is our duty to squash, communism and bring the words of Christ to a broken land. And so even, in the 70s, they were trying to use the flag of Christianity and, the great nation of the United States, to justify behavior that otherwise is completely anti-Christian. It's completely against the Bible's call to peace and Christ himself to peace. And this is going to be kind of a weird example, but I can't help but think of private schools that start because they want their children integrated in faith in their teaching. Which started this idea of like a private Christian school in Southern California in Orange County, which is one of the most conservative counties in the state of California. And there was a man who thought, well, my kids are not getting a good Christian education, so he started a school himself, so his kids wouldn't have to be taught all that riffraff that goes against, their Christian beliefs. And so there's almost like a divide and conquer type of mentality with Christian nationalism, and us versus them, and who's in and who's out. And the requirements always shift to justify current actions and current beliefs. And that to me it makes me skeptical, because you can watch them from decade to decade justify something that they used to think was abhorrent because they want to remain in power. They want to remain in influence. And I thank you for bringing up the schools. I think that is such a mark on our nation that it breaks my heart to this day to think of that. So, yeah.
I think it's always been the part of manifest destiny, that the United States should expand because we can bring the best to
Mhm.
others in the world. And part of that best is the Christian faith. And yeah, it's even a little bit in there about this talk about taking over Greenland or the Panama Canal. Like, why wouldn't they want to be US citizens? Because
Yes, who
we're
wouldn't want that?
superior. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're superior. So yeah, it's just been a part of our nation's fabric, I think.
This is the book I'm reading. You can kind of see it. I
Mhm.
accidentally bought a bunch
Wow.
of copies if you want one. But toward the beginning, she talks about Christian nationalism and tries to give it a definition. But even she says, you know, year to year, it can change based on the whims of whoever's in charge. But she said Christian nationalism is ultimately the belief that America is God's chosen country.
Yeah.
And we must defend our honor and we must serve as a beacon to the rest of the world, our goodness and our greatness. And unfortunately, then that also ties in with hyper-masculinity and, well, hyper-white masculinity, and distorting all the progress that the United States tries to make, from, you know, racial inequities to feminism to, as some people say in the book, the gays, I put in quotes, and how those are all challenging to the white masculine norm that they want to hold on to. And so the fear of losing this power again becomes, we need to establish ourselves as the dominant country, the powerful country, the nation under God, you know, which is when all that started to become a part of our political identity. It was, I think, in the 50s when they added that to the Pledge of Allegiance, and
Mhm.
shortly after onto our currency. It was all this attempt to establish ourselves as God's chosen nation. Yeah, and that never ends well, even in Christian history. It never ends well when Christians try to assert themselves as the dominant ones. We tend to commit some pretty catastrophic sins when that happens.
And that idea about masculinity and being challenged, and with women still not equal, but still having more prominent positions in the business world and working world, and white men feeling threatened. That also goes in with that type of Christianity too, where the man is supposed to be the head of the church and the strong one.
Oh, yes.
So it all ties in together that, of course, that should be the kind of Christianity we have in the US.
You know, when you say that the man should be the head, I remember, you know, one time I went to a little prayer meeting with a group of the people of the parish, and the men had been at a retreat, and they came to the prayer meeting to tell how the man is the head, and he's and so forth and so on. And I stood up and I said, "Oh no, I don't go for that at all." And the one guy got up and he said, "Now, sister, we're in slots. Just that word slots. Just." And then another one said, "Now, Sister Kay, you don't understand that because you're married, not married." And I said, "Yeah, but I think that's maybe why I do understand." And so that that whole thing, and yeah, and it so permeates so much of this Christian nationalism.
Yeah, it's always something, you know, I sometimes think the older I get, the less I know. I don't know if you probably don't experience that yet. But
I agree.
do you agree with that too? You can read something and be so inspired, and then you can find something on the opposite side of that that takes it all down because of the broadening of our thinking. And then I sit and I say, I don't think I dare say anything because I don't think I know anything. I don't think that's all bad, you know, but it just seems to me that we have a new God story now. And what are we going to do with the old God? Because science and spirituality are coming together so beautifully. Cosmology is out there. Psychology is out there. And so where do you stick the gospel into all that? Because you have to find all that psychology in the gospel, apparently. And it's there. Richard Rohr. I don't know if you heard about Richard Rohr.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't he put psychology right between the lines? And I just love it. He's got his latest book now is called The Tears of Things. And I think you would just love it. We're into the 6th chapter of it now. And he takes the Hebrew prophets and he just reams them out if they're not mature enough to. He goes through the stages of a prophet. What are they developmental stages that a prophet has to go through? And what stage do they end up in? And he talked about Amos the other day. And he says, the first stage of a prophet is they get kind of, hell and brimstone-y. They start thrashing around and beating on people. They realize that's not going to work. And then he traces it through the scriptures. I just can't even begin to tell you how he does that. But he said the final stage of being a true prophet is the stage of praise. They get through all of that fire and struggle and disorder and order. And finally, they see themselves as worshipers of praise, of the earth, of everything that enters our lives. So it might be a great book. I bet you would just groove on it because he really speaks so many different languages in English. He speaks so many different ways. We've been going through it now for Lent, and it just makes me feel like I've been through therapy. And I think what he's saying is that we just really, really have to be part of the remnant today, because that's how the Spirit worked through all the ages, is by finding these little remnants of people. And they didn't go through high-powered, positioned people. The Spirit kind of finds people on webinars like this, just to share all that accumulated wisdom that we've earned by our efforts to read and study and be with people. Gives you that ordinary prophetic gift that you might not even know you carry, but because you're there, you're present, and you say what has to be said. Because if you don't, they're going to get their last word. But I would really love to recommend that book. And it teaches me how to be much more gentle, not so irritated by what I think hasn't reached perfection yet, including myself.
It's interesting to think about the prophets in particular, or really anybody in scripture that is called to be a disciple. Is the trick is that at first they're like, no, I know nothing about this. I'm ill-equipped. I'm a big old coward. And so for me, I think a good marker for trustworthiness in someone who's trying to be a minister or be a leader is how self-assured are they? Do they have confidence in themselves, or do they have confidence in the message that they're sending? I like a little bit, or maybe a lot of it, of self-doubt in somebody, because I like to see that they're human. I like to see that they don't know it all and that they're willing to listen and willing to learn. And that, like, we might be entering an age now, kind of post-Christendom, where churches aren't the center of communities anymore. But I almost wonder if that's a good thing. We can start finding the authenticity in religion and not just, what am I trying to say? Not just church for church's sake, but church for the sake of the gospel. You're not going to have somebody in church these days who doesn't want to be there. Unlike the 50s, where you went to church on Sunday. That's just what you did. Yes, churches were bigger and there were more people in the pews, but now is the time for authenticity and vulnerability, which again flies in the face of Christian nationalism, because they find that to be, too feminine, too weak of an expression of faith. But I think that's where faith is really going to thrive.
I think so.
I found a quote during my study here that I just love to share with you. And I think it really goes on with what you just said. A society that does not have some sort of transcendent belief system, then politics will rush in to fill the void left by religion or any other form of communal belief. And then it will metastasize into fascism or totalitarianism. So
Who said that?
Some type of transcendency. Oh, his name is Paul, and his last name is Rahe.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's happening.
Yes. Yes. If there's a vacancy, who's going to rush in?
Do you think, and I think this fits in with the Christian nationalism too, do you think that, you know, people have gotten meaner, and it's in our government, and they see people ahead of our government being mean, and treating handicapped people, and well, the DEI, eliminating all that, and you know, I have a friend who grew up in the church, a young woman, and conservative values, which I, you know, respect. And so she voted for Trump, and now her son, who is autistic, is losing. They're cutting the program, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, how could I didn't see that happening?" But it seems like it's so. I know social media is part of it, but it seems like people have more permission now to be mean and nasty and to say negative things than to just say be racist, and you wonder if all of that has some connection to the fact that maybe we don't have as much of this transcendence, fewer people going to church, and you hope that in the church they're hearing values about loving your neighbor. And sometimes you wonder, where's that coming from, that it's okay to be mean and discriminate against my neighbor? Where are they getting that? They're not getting that from the Bible I read. So you wonder if all the spirituality and maybe lack of it, or thinking you have to be a certain way to be this strong Christian, like Anne was talking about, the Jesus and John Wayne. It seems like it's just all interconnected.
I think somebody said our nation hasn't gotten worse. It's just, it's all out in the open now. People are just saying and doing the things they didn't say and do before because they feel like they have the permission to do it. So it's almost kind of cleansing. Like now people are going to show you who they are. It's not hiding under a facade anymore. It's just out there, for better or worse.
Kathy, I'd like to ask you, we have time for one final question before we get into question and answers. And I want to make a question. What role do churches and faith leaders play in resisting Christian nationalism?
Okay, I gave this a lot of thought. And I'm going to refer again to the statement that was adopted in 2019, because there was a statement, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and all of these different denominations that signed it, the Network for Catholic Social Services, Tony Campolo with the Red Letter Christians, and he is a noted evangelical, Michael Curry with the Episcopalians, the Alliance of Baptists, Jim Wallace with Sojourners, ELCA, Presbyterians USA, Faith in Public Life, Latin Christian Networks, National Council of Churches. So they all signed a statement, you know, against Christian nationalism and how the U.S. shouldn't consider itself this privileged nation and having one religion. And then they had a webinar, which I attended in January of 2021. It wasn't long after the January 6th riot, actually, that they had this webinar. The riot was January 6th, and they did this January 27th. And you know that, and we haven't even brought that up yet, that was a huge indication of the Christian nationalism affecting politics. People were there with, you know, Christian flags, the Christian symbols. and they felt it was part of their Christianity to go and well, riot at the Capitol in order to keep this person that they feel is anointed by God. And they feel that even stronger after that assassination attempt. They feel God spared Trump for, his mission with America. And so they did this webinar. I attended it. And out of that, they have developed a discussion guide with 3 lessons and files that you can download and use, handouts. So it's all free. So it's an adult ed program of 3 sessions. In that webinar, Bishop Eaton was a part of that. Bishop Curry was a part of the webinar. This Amanda from the Baptist Joint Committee, Religious Liberty, was part of it. And it was very good. Now, have we used that at our church yet? No, we have not. So I was going to say, through adult education, with our, most churches have an adult ed program. We can teach about Christian nationalism. We can do it through our Bible studies. We've had discussions about this at a women's Bible study I belong to, and then from the pulpit. And our lead pastor a couple of weeks ago made the statement in his sermon that you didn't have to be a Christian to be a leader in the government. And that was talked about a lot afterwards in a positive way. But he just said, you don't have to be a Christian to lead in our government offices. And then this past Sunday, we went to a church service here in Hawaii. We're on Maui, and we always went to a Methodist church. So I'm really ecumenical. I grew up Methodist. I went to a Baptist seminary for part of my seminary. I went to Luther, and then I worked at a Presbyterian church. I have lots of Catholic friends, so I need to go work at the Catholic church next.
Yeah, come on.
So this Methodist church, unfortunately, was on Front Street here, and it burned down in the fire, but now they're meeting in the Congregational Church building. And so we went there and saw some of the people we see. We come here for about 3 weeks every year. And the pastor talked about Christian nationalism in his sermon, and the dangers of it. And I wanted to go, yay!
Yes.
So we just need to, as church leaders and as pastors, priests, we need to educate people, because a lot of them don't understand it. They really don't. They hear the term and they think it sounds positive, and they don't understand the dangers. So I think we have a responsibility, and I will be talking to our lead pastor about doing a session on this. We've been occupied with some other things, but I think that, and there's tools out there to use.
Yes.
You just need to do
I
it.
like what you said about, how he mentioned that you don't have to be a Christian to be a leader in this country, which makes a lot of sense. It's logical, but it almost feels like you have to be, or at least pretend to be, to get elected to those positions. And what's most ironic is the people who have the most success in politics probably live the least Christian lives, and the people who lead with integrity and compassion don't succeed in the political world because they're not going to play those dangerous games.
Yeah.
And I immediately think of Jimmy Carter, who was not a successful politician, but probably one of the kindest and most compassionate presidents we've ever had. But he couldn't use that compassion in the office because it didn't play well in the hard-hitting political atmosphere that he was in. So it would be so nice if there was somebody truly in there who led with their heart instead of their political agendas or aspirations.
Well, don't you think it all boils down to human development? What are the stages of how a human develops into full humanity? It seems like if you had 2, cosmology or psychology, which one do you think would lead us closer to religion? Cosmology or psychology? That's a question I read the other day. And I thought, well, it must be cosmology. No, this writer said it's psychology. Finding out who we are. We've just arrived on this huge, huge planet, and we're so new. And I don't think our psychology has kept up with our technology. And perhaps that's what needs to be part of teaching and preaching, is just knowing what a human being needs to hear. And I love Ken Wilber's. I don't know if you're familiar with Ken Wilber. He's an outstanding philosopher. He just looks like Gandhi. I mean, he looks like he's fast and sprays all day. I'm not sure, but he talks about the colors of human development. When you're born, he gives you a ball. Okay, you take a ball and you paint one side of it red and the other side blue. And you show that ball to a 1-year-old. And that 1-year-old is going to say, this is a red ball. Because that little 1-year-old is still in an egoic stage of development, and it thinks it's the only person in the world. Well, as that little child grows older, you realize you turn that ball around and it's got a blue side. So all of a sudden, that little child knows that that ball has, you ask that little child, what color is my side of the ball? And they'll say blue, because earlier they thought it was red. So then we begin to move into more of an anthropocentric development. And that would be kind of vague orange amber color. Then we have the green, when a human becomes more world-centric, or you see a bigger world. And then the cosmological, then you get the cosmocentric. And then you feel like you're in this one universe that has complete wholeness in itself. And that's let's see, that's the path we're all on. But I think it has to almost be taught. And if it can be lined with scripture, because I think there's a lot of psychology in scripture, or all the religious stories, Islam, all of those stories have marvelous relationships to that concept. But I just think human development has to really be the change agent as we relate to our own religious spiritual selves, because that's just my take in my old age. I don't know what color I am now. Oh, and the turquoise is the integral. So wear a lot of turquoise. Finally get it all together, and then it got lifted. Yeah.
For me, I think it's any social justice movement, I think, has to start from a place of compassion and a place of modeling in your own lives and your own actions what you deem to be important. And so if we're truly Christians against Christian nationalism, then we have to be willing to look pretty foolish in the eyes of a lot of our nation in trying to espouse the ideals that we know to be true. It's always fun to think that the word Christian comes from a word that literally means little Christs. And if we want to be little Christ, well, that means we stop and talk to the person along the side of the road who is sick. That means we offer a cup of water to somebody who is thirsty, not because they've qualified for some sort of government subsidy, but because they're thirsty. We reach out to those who are disenfranchised by the very world that they live in. And I think if we model those behaviors, you might remember the phrase, they go low, we go high, that kind of a thing. For me, the only way to combat this in my mind is authenticity in the ways that we express our faith and the ways that we put our faith into action. And who knows if what the next, brand of Christian nationalism will look like, because it changes so much, but ultimately the calling of Christ doesn't change, and that's to love.
I've been fortunate in retirement to have more time, of course, mainly retired. And I feel my calling, part of my faith calling, is to be an activist. So, I'm on the Cure Board, and I also am heading up an indivisible Kansas County group, which has grown to 600 and some members now. And we work on political issues, because I see that's where social justice happens. And we have to ensure, that people are cared for through laws. And we had a big protest a while ago in front of our representative's office in Wilmer, and we had 300 and some people show up. It was amazing. And everyone was bundled up because it was so cold. And we had people from our congregation that I didn't know were of, that wanted to get involved in that, because I don't preach that from the pulpit. I don't go up there and say, I'm doing this, you guys all show up. They just like the authenticity she was talking about. So they came through the line on Sunday and they said they were there. And of course, I didn't recognize anyone because everyone had it was cold. They had all their fur hats and all that stuff on, but it was a pleasant surprise to see that there's a lot of people that agree that we need to be vocal and, stand up against some of these issues of injustice.
I really want to thank all of our participants, hey, Annette, Kathy, and Anne, so much for coming and sharing your wisdom with us. It was very enlightening and just so interesting to me. So I really appreciate you being here.